Every small town has their fair share of creepy urban legends to keep their residents in line. These 5 subscribers shared their personal creepy encounters with the creepy and unknown. If you have a story you'd like to share, such as a cabin in the woods story or possibly an unexplainable happening, be sure to send it in to swampdweller.net or the email you can find in the description down below. I'd love to hear from you and share your tale with everyone here in the swamp. Now, let's dive into these creepy small town horror stories. It was summer of 2018, and like many others, I went on vacation to a place somewhat isolated from people, just to get away. I had gone with my 2 cousins to a ranch we own in Lake Perris, California. For reference, I will call one M and the older one J, M being the same age as me at 24, and J at 28. I had been planning to go visit them for almost 3 years, but I hadn't gotten the chance, due to transportation and always having to work. I only had just gotten the chance to be able to travel because I had crashed my brand new Ninja motorcycle in September of 2017, breaking my collarbone and 3 of my ribs, rendering me unable to work. While recovering, I was living in the Bay Area by San Francisco, and to think I wanted to ride 8 to 10 hours out to my family's ranch on a bike, that would have been suicide, since I'm not at all familiar with the roads. Anyways, I had finally gone to visit, and I thought it was going to take much of my stress away. In many ways, it did. But during my time there, it seemed like things just started to get worse. Not only did my girl dump me, but strange things started happening again, like my uncle's mom passing away, and, along with my cousin M that was sitting next to me at the time, seeing her spirit late one night at around 2 a.m. We both started to see weird things. We both turned to each other one night to see something peeking into the room at the same time, and I asked him, Did you see that? I stood up to see if it was my other cousin trying to creep us out. When I walked out the door, I saw my great-aunt's face and top torso turning and fading away into thin air. I automatically ran into the room on my tippy toes and both hands on my chest, repeating what I saw to her over and over again. Well, 2 days after, in between everything that was happening at the time, me and my cousin Jay decided to go smoke a bowl under the large evergreen tree in the back, by where all the cow, chickens, and goats are kept, with the intention of avoiding my aunts and uncles smelling what we were up to, out of respect. So, it was a bright sunny day. I and Jay, along with our huge all-black 200-pound Great Dane Abigail, was just chilling on a wooden bench under the evergreen. Staring out to some of the hills, where there were no more or 2 or 3 miles away, I noticed a large black horse, pacing side to side in the middle of the 2 biggest hills, behind what looked like a barbed wire fence that ran along the top of the hills, pairing the sides of the old abandoned building that looked like it was used to be a slaughterhouse. Really thinking nothing of it, I looked at the dog laying in front of us, whose head and ears were both aiming straight up at the black figure, high up between the hills. When I realized just how long that thing had been there, I had seen it come up from the hills about 15 or 20 minutes earlier, and Abigail had not taken her eyes off of it the entire time. So I turned to my cousin to tell him about the horse, and if he had ever seen it there before, just to find him frozen with the bong and lighter in his hands, also looking right at it. He had this look of terror on his face. When I looked back towards the thing, I saw it was standing on its 2 back legs and facing right at us. Its front legs were side by side as it was trying to intimidate us or something. We were all just frozen, including the dog. She didn't make a move. I think either she was used to it or she felt safe with having us around. After almost a minute of looking at it, it seemed to shrink before our eyes, till it almost looked human-like, when I said to Jay, "Holy crap, I think that might be a skinwalker." He quickly responded by telling me to shut up and to ignore it. He almost begged me to be quiet. It went from what looked like a 10-foot tall creature thing to like 6 foot in only a few seconds. Judging by the old building only about 100 yards away from it, I know these things and what they are capable of. I'm Mexican born in California, but Mexican culture has a big part of my life. Along with its folklore and older stories of witchcraft and people who practice its deeper roots, Mexican culture is right up there next to Native American culture, if not the same. I'm scared to even mention any of this to anyone, but it's good for a cause. It's time that people know the truths and secrets of humans and unhuman things that are so oblivious to humanity. To that thing dwelling in the hills of Lake Paris, stay the hell away from our family, and hopefully I'll never have to see this thing again. Also, importance to the evergreen tree that we were at. The evergreen tree is known to be used by witch doctors in Mexico to keep evil and bad spirits away. Maybe not just a coincidence that there is a big-ass one in the middle of our ranch. I don't know why, but that dog would not leave my side for 2.5 weeks when I was there. Even my cousins pointed it out. Jay also told me that I'm weird, but in a good way, whatever that means. Well, to start this off, I grew up in the 1970s in a small town in North Carolina. Well, it was almost too small to be called a town, with only a school and a couple of small shops. I'm guessing you can imagine how boring it would be to be a teenager there, and it would have been so if it wasn't for the woods. The neighborhood that I lived in was backed up to a big forest that spread out for about 3 miles, and it's where I spent most of my teenage years with my 2 best friends, Levi and Connor. They both were in my class at this time. We were all 15. Levi lived across the street. He was smart and kinda quiet, unlike Connor, who lived down at the bad side of the neighborhood. Connor was a troublemaker, always getting sent to the dean's office at least once a week. He was loud, obnoxious, and a natural leader, always finding something for us to do. Be it legal or not, when he was around, we were never bored. It was the beginning of the summer holidays, and Levi had called for me. We went down to get Connor, and he was messing around with his younger brother's scooter in the front yard. We asked him if he wanted to go into the woods, and he said yes. Now, just in case this may be necessary, Connor had almost black shaggy hair, the most beautiful eyes. One was a light blue while the other was a brownish color. He always wore scuffy red Converse shoes and a denim jacket, and of course, I just had the biggest crush on him. While Levi had style brown hair, brown eyes, and freckles and was considerably shorter than me. Then there was myself, a red-headed brown-eyed girl that had quite a lot of people scared of me due to me being hyper. I was always ready to go somewhere or do something, and I was always talking about something. Anyway, we made our way into the woods and started walking into a random direction. We did this for fun, just to see what happens. Usually, we would try to get lost and try to find our way back, which most of the time just led us to being late for dinner and getting sent to our beds early, or worse for worse, getting grounded. But we did it anyway. We were making our way along a deer trail that I didn't think we had ever been on before, when Connor found a pile of crap, and of course, dipped a stick into it, and then tried to chase us with it. Levi and I, of course, freaked out and scattered. Neither of us wants to be smeared with crap. I ran off, and luckily for me, Connor followed Levi instead in the opposite direction. After a while of them not coming back, I began to think they had left me, and I was furious. I was walking down the way I had seen them run, when suddenly something stuck out the bush and grabbed me. I let out a surprised yelp, and Connor shushed me, only for me to shout at him scaring me. Only when I saw the look on his face, I decided that I shouldn't be talking, and I shut my mouth. Connor whispered to me, "You have got to say this." and began to lead me through the bushes, and further we went. The more and more we went, the more I could smell something disgusting. We came across something green. Levi started staring at the ground with a weird expression on his face. I was about to ask what was wrong, but Connor tugged me past him a few more feet, away to where there was this ditch, and in the ditch I could only describe as something out of a nightmare. It was a body. It was a purple-blue color. It almost looked swollen. The stench was so terrible I had to cover my mouth with my jumper so as not to gag. I backed up to where Levi was. Connor stood looking into the trench for about 5 more seconds before he walked back over to us. "Cool, huh?" he said with a grin. Levi gave him a disgusting look before saying, "No, it ain't cool. We need to go home and call the police." "What? Why?" What do you mean, why? There's a body dumped in the woods, Connor. It's clearly been murdered." "No, man, it's so cool. We cannot get the police. If we do, they're gonna take this away and think we were the killers." "Why would they think it was us?" "Because that's what the police do, man." "Don't be stupid, Connor. You can't stop me." "Fuck's sake, man. If you get the police out here, this'll just be on the news and we'll get questioned by everybody. They'll probably set out a curfew, they'll ban us from going into the forest, there'll be police everywhere, and then, you know what? Summer will freaking suck." I had just been quietly watching the argument take place, not really caring about what happened. But that got me, and there was no way in hell I was going to let my summer get ruined. "Connor's right." "What? You're not serious?" "Levi, we have the whole summer left to do whatever we want. Do you really want to spend it inside with a curfew?" "Yeah, man, 2 against 1. Come on, you can't do anything stupid." Levi looked crushed. "Fine, but I'm not coming near this again." Connor had let out a whoop of joy, and we had made our way home listening to him talk about how cool it would be and how this would be our secret. Well, the secret didn't last very long, as by the end of the week Connor had shown all the rest of our friends, and it was a miracle that nobody did call the police. But I guess that just goes to show how close everybody was. We were like one big family, and almost like all families, we had our secrets. The body remained there for the rest of the summer. I only went up a few more times and it had gotten less interesting. As each time we went, there were only bones left. Anyway, on the last week of summer vacation, we decided to have a big camp out with all of our friends. There was me, Levi, Connor, Josh, and Walsh. He was a loud-mouthed boy with mousy hair and blue eyes. Alice was there as well. She was a quiet girl with straight brown hair. Courtney was there, who I could only describe as the only girl I actually saw as a friend, probably because she was the only one who put thought into things and didn't have a bratty attitude. And then there was Kenny, the kid whose garden we were camping in. He had sandy blonde hair, brown eyes, freckles. His dad owned the biggest garden, so of course we could camp there. And as an added bonus, Kenny's garden backed right up into the woods. And even though we had promised Kenny's mom that we wouldn't go into the woods after dark, we were definitely planning to. But unfortunately, our plans were foiled by a good old Mother Nature, as she decided to make it rain. So all 7 of us piled into this big tent, which belonged to Courtney. We played cards for about 2 hours, making up new games with crazy rules. Joss even suggested that we play strip poker, only to have a shoe chucked at him and to be told that if he carried on acting like a pedo, we would send him home. He quieted down after that, and we carried on playing until Kenny began complaining that we were going to run out of oxygen. This went on for a good 10 minutes before he decided to unzip the tent and stick out his head so he could breathe. "Hey guys, the rain stopped," said Kenny excitedly. "Seriously?" I said. "Yeah, let's go do something." We then all argued for a good 20 minutes about where we were going to go and what we were going to do. And so far, breaking into school and hanging out there was winning until Connor said, "Why don't we go see the body?" That was it. Everyone put on their shoes and coats, and Kenny took down his dollar store flashlight that he had hung from the roof of Courtney's tent, and off we went. Connor and Kenny led the way, but Kenny's flashlight, to be honest, was pretty crap and didn't light anything very well. And I don't believe that we needed it anyway, because even though I hadn't been to the body in weeks, it was burned into my mind how to get there. The whole way there we were talking about what it would look like now, and how creepy this all was, and then the conversation took a turn that it never had before. We began talking about who we thought the body was and why they were dead, and who had murdered them, and this scared me because it made me see it for what it really was, a dead body of a murdered person hidden by someone in the woods, and we had never reported it. I brought this issue up to Connor, who simply stated, "It's too late now, there's probably only bones left, and even if we did tell the police, we would get in trouble for holding off for so long." To this, I remained silent, and kept walking alongside Courtney and Levi, listening to Josh telling Alice some bullshit story behind us. They soon went silent though. As we came to the ditch, Connor and Kenny stood silently at the edge, shining the flashlight into it, Kenny's mouth agape in horror. I asked what it was, and Connor shushed me and beckoned me and the rest of us over with his finger. As I came up to the edge, what I saw had freaked me out. In that ditch was something piled on top of the original body. It was wrapped in a yellow floral pattern bedsheet, and it was tied with some sort of string at the top to make it not slip off. Everyone stood silent for what felt like hours, but in reality, it was probably only a couple of seconds before Connor pulled his Stanley knife out of his pocket and descended into the ditch. Levi began to protest, but Connor turned and shushed him and whispered to Kenny to shine his light on him, to which Kenny obeyed Connor, then cut some of the string and pulled at the seat to reveal the face of a young girl. She stared up at us with a dead glaze over her eyes and a blank expression. I felt like I was going to be sick, and apparently so did Levi, as he began to violently retch, and he turned away. I couldn't turn away no matter how hard I tried. I was mesmerized. Connor suddenly jumped back, with a look of sudden realization and horror crossed his pale face as he began to scramble up the side of the ditch. Josh helped him up, and a chorus of what happened and what was it began, only to have him frantically shush us. With a shaking voice he said, "It's dry as bone." A feeling of absolute dread settled in my stomach. If you don't get what the big deal was, it had rained only an hour earlier, and everything was wet, and this body was dry, which means that it had been put here recently. Everyone was silent. Then there was a noise behind us across the ditch, and my heart was in my throat. As we turned around and Kenny quickly pointed his flashlight at where the noise was coming from, then, click. Suddenly from across the ditch came an extremely bright light, illuminating us and making the person holding the light impossible to see. "Run!" yelled Connor, grabbing me by the arm, and everyone sprinted, and whoever it was with the light sprinted to where we were. They were running violently, randomly illuminating trees and brushes that scared the shit out of some deer. And then suddenly, it went off. I felt my heart stop, and Connor was muttering, "Shit, shit, shit, where the heck is he?" under his breath as we ran for our lives. I tried listening to hear if a guy was still coming after us, but everything was so blurry I just couldn't keep track of who was doing what and where the noises were. Levi stumbled, and a couple of seconds later, face streaked with tears of fear, followed by Josh. We huddled together and everyone began blabbering out what the heck was going on, and who was that, and what do we do if he finds us? But then Courtney spoke up. "Where's Alice?" Everyone went silent and looked towards the woods in fear, until Levi spoke up. Kenny, go get your dad." Connor looked over to glare at Levi before turning to Kenny and barking, "No, Kenny, don't get your dad. Let's think about this, okay?" What do you mean, let's think about this? He will call the police, and don't you think the police are gonna believe us? I don't think so. This arguing went on for probably 5 more minutes, until eventually, everybody shushed up. Kenny begins pounding on his back door, and this goes on for about 5 minutes before Mr. Stokes opens the new door with a red face. "What are you guys doing? What are you playing, boys? 2 in the goddamn morning," he hollered. "Dad, Alice is in the woods." "What? She ran in when we were playing tag and she hasn't come back out. We think she got lost." Mr. Stokes stared off into the woods for a bit, squinting, trying to see beyond the tree line before muttering an okay and repeating into the house, to only 5 minutes return with a big flashlight. He stomped off into the woods and we all waited for about 20 minutes before he returned and said, "Fun's home, kids. Go home, get your fathers, and tell them to bring flashlights." And that was it. We all went home, told our parents what was going on, and the men went into the woods to look for Alice. While the woman stood around in Kenny's backyard, we were all told to stay at home, to which I didn't. I crossed the street and knocked on Levi's door. He answered it and I stepped inside, and apparently Connor had the same idea, as he was sitting on the sofa in Levi's room, eating some chips. "Do you think they'll find her?" I asked quietly. "Yeah, she's probably just panicked and got herself lost," said Connor. "And what if he got her? What if she's dead? What are we gonna do then?" said Levi, as he stood by the window looking into the dark street. Suddenly, the sound of police sirens cut through the air. "Oh no," mumbled Levi as the police cars drove down the road to Kenny's house. We watched as 2 police cars pulled up and the men came out carrying big flashlights. They walked around the back into the woods. After that, I and Kenny went home, and I watched out my window as suddenly 5 more police cars appeared at my parents' house. It was around 6 in the morning at this point. I asked my mother what had happened, and she told me that they found a body in the woods, and that it wasn't looking good. The next day, the police interviewed all of us, and we all stuck to Connor's story. They didn't find Alice, and just like he said, it would be there as news coverage. A ban on us was going into the woods, and there was a curfew for 9 p.m., and when we went back to school, there was an assembly of safety for strangers. They found Alice in the end, 12 days later, chopped up into little pieces and crammed into a garbage can on the side of the road about 10 miles from her house. I have my own kids now, and since I've lost contact with all of my childhood friends apart from Levi, who I now have a child to, and he recently told me that Kenny had been killed due to an overdose, we were invited to a funeral along with the rest of the kids I grew up with. I will not be attending that funeral. I once rented a room in a small house in Hartford, Connecticut. This house was actually quite nice, with hardwood floors and a stove that heated the entire house during winter. You walked up some flat, circular stone steps to access the front door, and the landlady had a pretty garden out front. The back of the house was a bit of a mess, and she had, as I soon discovered, a hoarding disorder. Although I could see her home was cluttered, I simply needed a place to stay. One entire room was blocked off because she had so much stuff in it. Still, the room I was renting was charming and the bed was comfortable. I shared it with her and her one child, who was still in school. The bathroom was large enough to share, and there was a washer and dryer and Wi-Fi. Another person briefly rented the room downstairs before she bounced and checked out. I started having odd experiences in this house. It had an aura of stress to it. For instance, one night, I was alone in the house, as the landlady had gone to spend the weekend with her fiancé. It was cold enough that she put wood chips in the stove before leaving. I enjoyed watching the flickering in the darkness. The living room took on a calmer feeling, like the fire inside the stove began to stir. All of a sudden, I had the awful feeling that someone was standing next to me. Spooked, I went upstairs into my room and shut the door. The next weird experience came when I was doing laundry in her messy basement. By this time, I was growing tired of the incredible mess. She kept the living room tidy, but that was about it. I wandered around the dark room as the washer spun, then stopped in a kind of odd horror. Someone had sprayed painted the words "fuck" in blood on the back of the steps. Entirely chilled, I found my Bible and prayed over the words. I wondered if Satanists had lived in the house or witches at one point. I started to feel like I was living in the presence of evil. The room I was staying in grew colder, night after night, literally. I began to feel like I was suffocating and struggled to sleep. One night, I rolled over, sleepy and chilled, and looked at the digital alarm clock. It was around 4:20 a.m. I looked towards the window at the far end of the room, where she kept a round, mirrored coffee table. There was a dark mass there, with no face, just staring at me. I could see curly hair, but no distinct features. It was hovering, almost as if it was lying on its side. I screamed and turned on the light. I asked my landlady the next day if she had heard me screaming, but she denied it. I knew she had once been married to a man who evidently had abused her. When I spoke to her boyfriend, I decided to take a risk. I inquired about my landlady's husband, who was now deceased. Her fiancé told me that the neighbors had described him as evil. I hesitated when I asked if he had curly hair. He replied in the affirmative. I am convinced that I saw some sort of imprint of this person, manifested at a spiritual sensitivity, which I had possessed for most of my life. Later on, I saw a photo of this husband and the landlady's child. He indeed had dark curly hair. This happened to me when I was about 10 years old, and it still haunts me. This was around 1969 or 1970, and pop bottles was how us kids came up with money for candy or whatever. I would search everywhere for them. Construction sites were gold mines. I would regularly search abandoned properties. I was a little braver than my friends, so I would always have a little more money to show for my efforts. There was a large and creepy house, by itself on the outside of our neighborhood in our small little town, that was clearly abandoned. I never went in there. Something about it just felt different and a little scary, even to me. But having nothing to show for my pop bottle search, I decided to quickly check it out. I should have stuck with my instincts, but I ignored them and went in, which was a big mistake. The walls were painted an awful shade of green, even the ceilings, but the chilling thing was the mirrors. There must have been hundreds of them. They were literally everywhere. Many were in the floor broken, and you couldn't even walk through without stepping on pieces of them. They were of all sizes and shapes, hanging on wires or frames, or just stands or shelves, or just leaning against the walls. You could see all around you, and every room you went. I never imagined something like this, and it blew my mind. I couldn't process what I was seeing because it horrified me. My heart started pounding and I felt dizzy. It was way too much, and I got out of there, and I didn't think my feet even touched the steps leaving the place. I sat by a tree for a long time and got myself together before going home. I was soaking wet from sweating and feeling very sick. I will never know who put those mirrors up or what they were afraid of, but that image has stayed with me my entire life. I even hate the shade of green when I see it. They had a house of mirrors at a fair, and just looking at it made me sick. Even at a department store that has a large display of backed by mirrors, I have to look away. My days of exploring abandoned places have come to an end. You never know what's going to be on inside. It might just give you a phobia you're stuck with for the rest of your life. This happened back when I was 12 or 13 years old. Now, a little backstory here. My dad and I volunteered at a bird banding station. If you don't know what bird banding is, it is where researchers put small metal bands on the legs of birds, and then release them, to track their migration patterns. We'd set out mist nets in the woods to catch the birds. We used nets instead of traditional traps so we wouldn't harm the birds. So anyway, the guy who owned the bird banding station and the entire property, let's call him R, would let me wander the woods, while he was collecting birds out of the nets. R's property was massive, with woods, countryside, marshland, and you name it, all out here on the edge of a small town. Now back to the story. It was a cool summer morning. I was wandering in my usual part of the forest. It wasn't long before I noticed that it was unusually silent, which was odd. I usually hear at least one thrush or blue jay, but there was nothing. All of a sudden in the distance, I hear what sounds like a distressed baby deer or cat. Being the curious animal lover I was, I followed the noise. However, as I got closer to the sound, it seemed to grow a lot farther away. It wasn't long before I came to the edge of our property. The wailing sounded like it was coming from nearby 1 minute, and then sounding very far away the next. Despite being confused and a little creeped out, I for some reason still followed it. However, a few minutes later, I came across a small deer blind. I looked inside to see if anyone was messing with me, but there was nobody there. When I got a better look at the blind, I noticed something a bit off. There were massive slashes on the sides. They looked as if a person had slashed them with a knife, or an animal's claw marks. But there were no bears in this part of Michigan. Odd. So being a curious 13-year-old, I continued on my way to finding this distressed animal. I was walking along the edge of ours woods, trying not to go too far. I'm starting to get frustrated. Where the heck was this scream coming from? So being the naive little girl I was, I mimicked the noise that I was hearing to try to find my way back to the animal, to see if it would show itself. Not a minute passes by and I hear a noise that I will never forget. It sounded like a dog's growl, mixed with a buck's grunt. No deer sounded like this though. Something in my brain told me to get the heck out of there, and I did, leaping over twigs and branches until I'm in R's front yard. As I'm making my way towards his house, I hear the same sound, growling, coming from the woods, about 10 meters behind me at the very least. So instead, I run towards the research sack. Since R wasn't at the house and the doors would most likely be locked, I knew that no one would believe me. So I just said that a deer growled at me. However, I've heard deer grunts and snorts all my life, and they do not even compare to the animal that I heard. It didn't sound like a coyote or a dog either. Although, I never saw the thing. I believe that it was trying to get me off the property to do who knows what. I'm guessing that it might have been a Wendigo, since they can mimic noises of other animals and even voices. I also live near the Great Lakes, a hot spot for Wendigo sightings, maybe even a skinwalker, but they tend to be more in the western states. So, whenever you're in the woods and something doesn't seem right, don't just brush it off. Thanks for watching this video. If you enjoyed these stories, be sure to hit that like button, as it helps me out a ton. If you're new to the swamp, why not subscribe and turn on notifications to never miss another video. I upload videos almost every single day on all things natural and supernatural. If you have a story that you'd like to share in a future video, be sure to send it in to the website or the email that you can find in the description down below. I would love to share your story. Currently, I'm looking for cabin in the woods stories, so if you have one of those or even another story, I would love to see it. I'll see you guys soon with another creepy video.